Hey everybody, Saad here again. I never fail you. Another fantastic guest today. I've got Dr. Charles Murray, a political scientist. He probably doesn't need an introduction. First, let me say hello, Charles.
Hello, God.
I just want to read some of his books. It's not the full list of books, but it's quite a few of them. I think I've put them in chronological order. By the way, you are the F.A. Hayek Chair, Emeritus Scholar in Cultural Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. So here are some of the books. It all started in 1984, Losing Ground. Then you have In Pursuit of Happiness and Good Government. Then, of course, the one that catapulted you as a household name, The Bell Curve, What It Means to Be a Libertarian, Human Accomplishment. I think I'd like to talk about some of the stuff in that book. Real Education, Four Simple Truths for Bringing America's Schools Back to Reality, Coming Apart, American Exceptionalism, Human Diversity, and then the book that just came out this year, Facing Reality, Two Truths About Race in America. So here's what I thought we would start by doing first, Charles. I'm going to tell you two personal anecdotes because then we could link it to some of the stuff that has, gotten you into all sorts of hot water because of some of the positions that you've taken. And you'll see in a second why I'm setting it up this way. So yesterday I was out with my wife and one of our children. Our other child was home doing some homework. He's 9 years old, the son who was with us. And he's writing in this, Dear Diary kind of journal. I like this French teacher, but I don't like this teacher. So he's basically recounting his day. And I said to him, what would be fun, son, is if we try to do a new type of exercise. Why don't I propose a position? And then you think about whether you're for that position or against that position and try to articulate your position in your book, in your diary. And so I said to him, do you think it's ever okay to lie? And so then he, paused and then wrote, with some grammatical errors and some spelling errors. And the first part of his answer was very much of a consequentialist ethical perspective, which is, if I'm trying to save my family from being harmed, then I think it would be okay to lie. Now, why am I saying that story? Because if I'm not his dad, so first you have father absence. I'm not father absent. We're giving him good genes to start off with life. My wife has a degree in mathematics. I am putting him in a world of ideas where I challenge him as a 9-year-old. So do you think that, and I'm going to tell you a second story first, but rather than babble on for too long before you come in, do you think that just by the fact that you come with the lottery of life that allows for that exercise to take place yesterday could resolve some of the things that you otherwise find in your empirical studies?
If I understand you correctly, how much difference does it make that your child is getting that kind of question asked of him and that kind of exercise as opposed to if you didn't? As a parent, my instinctive answer is it probably makes a lot of difference.
Right.
As a person who looks at the data on heritability of traits, I have to tone down my expectations for that because what we're talking about is the shared environment for kids. The shared environment is a technical term, as you're well aware. So that if you have twins, both twins have the same parents, they have the same socioeconomic status, et cetera, that's the shared environment. And all of the numbers indicate that the shared environment and your kind of interaction with your child as part of that explains very little of all sorts of outcomes, all the way from educational attainment to behavioral traits and emotional traits and the rest of it. God, this has been a long-standing internal contradiction for myself because I have 4 kids. I really like to think that being a good parent has made a difference to them. I like to think that I had a mother who was extremely demanding on things like telling the truth, for example. And I've often thought that her influence was really important in the way I turned out. That's all my personal gut feeling about this, and I find it very hard to defend that position empirically.
I think I can't remember her. I think it's Judith Harris who maybe
Yes.
you right. So I mean, she speaks to exactly your point in that she has done the heavy lifting in a book called The Nurture Assumption, which would then support exactly what you're saying, which is we grant way too much parental causality or the effects of parental causality, where in reality, hence nurture assumption, it's your peers that end up affecting you more. And yet, I can't help but feel, just like you, even though I am a psychologist, look, there is research that shows that, I'm looking behind you, there are tons of books. There is some work that shows that, a great predictor of how well your children will do is just count how many books are in the household. And I've got something like, just in my own study, maybe 400 books. And so based on that metric, my child should grow up to be Einstein. So, I mean, what does the empirical findings suggest that all that we're talking about, it's not supporting any of what we're saying?
Yeah, so that the shared environment explains usually on things like IQ and, for that matter, life achievement, explains what, 8, 10, 15% of the variance depending on the trait. It's very seldom a lot more than that, especially for the most important outcomes. And it's not just one study that's found this. You have, 30, 40, 50 years of twin studies that have found the same thing over and over and over again. And by the way, every time you have an example like the one you just gave of your interaction with your child, it so happens I'm writing a review of a book about the biography of Tom Sowell.
Love him.
And Tom Sowell, whose career accomplishments are kind of mind-boggling in terms of both the intellectual depth and the breadth of the stuff he's done. The guy grew up, no father. His father died before he was born. His mother's an impoverished maid in segregated South Carolina in 1930. She has 4 other kids. She can't take care of him. She farms him out to, I can go on and on. Tom Sowell experienced a terrible childhood in terms of intellectual stimulation. Terrible.
Albeit,
Yes.
forgive me for interrupting you, Charles. Forgive me. I'm so sorry for interrupting you. Albeit, there was an important environmental catalyst. I can't remember the gentleman who took him to the New York Public Library, where he couldn't believe that there's this place where there are all these books cataloged. So in a sense, that is, there's got to be some spark. Because, I mean, if we lose that hope, then we're screwed, right?
Okay, but I'll just finish the point.
Sure, sorry.
I don't think that he would say that that was a pivotal moment in which he started to get interested in this stuff. He is, and here's sort of the proof of the pudding as an adolescent. He was a high school dropout, but the kicker is the high school he dropped out of was Stuyvesant, which is this highly selective high school, which you only get into if you have stratospherically high test scores. And he obviously recovered from his dropout phase. I'm just making the point. There are so many kids that have really awful childhoods who do extraordinary things. And in fact, there is a school of thought that I suppose you've encountered that, you know what? If you want to do really have unusual accomplishments in life, happy childhood is not really all that great.
I guess I'm a testament to that, because I grew up in the brutality of the Lebanese civil war. It wasn't a good thing to be Jewish in Lebanon. We were part of the last bastion of Jews who steadfastly refused to leave the Middle East. That didn't turn out too well. I mean, it turned out well in that we didn't get executed. But I always tell people that, having had a childhood that tested my anti-fragility, to use the term of my good friend Nassim Taleb, a fellow Lebanese, actually allowed me to have perspective on life. It allows me to, while whatever victimhood I've experienced in my life is part of my identity, it doesn't define me. On the contrary, I'm defined by the fact that I've overcome all those adversities, and I'm able to sit down now and have a conversation with Charles Murray. So I'm not wallowing, sucking my thumb in a corner about boo-hoo what happened to me in my childhood. My parents were kidnapped by Fatah. The things that happened to them, I wouldn't wish them on my worst enemies. And yet we persevered. We came to Canada and we've made a life for ourselves.
Well, there you go.
Yeah. Okay, so let me tell you story 2. Although maybe at this point we're beating the horse to death, or the dead horse. this is a story that some of my viewers may already be familiar with, and I discussed it in my latest book. So when I finished my MBA, I'd always planned on going straight for my PhD, but I had one brother, older brother, who was a very successful businessman in Southern California. I had been accepted to UC Irvine among several doctoral programs. And so when I went to visit UC Irvine, he told me, well, why don't you hang out with me for a day or two, and maybe you want to work with me for a few years, put on the proverbial suit, don't just kind of go through your whole educational trajectory, get some work experience before you go back. And so being the older brother, I humored his desire. I hung out with him, but I really wasn't very keen on not pursuing my PhD. Now, my mother catches wind of my brother's attempts to lure me away from academia, if only temporarily. And so when I return home to visit them at their house in Montreal, she takes me to a side room, very seriously, very concerned, says, well, I've heard about what happened with your brother. Do you know that you want to bring shame to the family? So her perspective was that someone who already had a bachelor's degree in mathematics and computer science and an MBA from a leading university and then dropped out of school would bring shame to the family. Now, of course, you can see why I'm saying this, right? Because the bar is set so high that it would bring shame to drop out of school after these degrees. So now, of course, I didn't pursue my PhD to please my mother's exacting standards, of course not, but yet that's the environment you grow up in. And again, I can't help but think that all other things equal, ceteris paribus, we want to put the best foot forward for children. And I think if more, sorry, I'm rambling, but let me just give you another example. It was recently an African American Museum of Culture, whatever, put out a whole poster saying that the scientific method, meritocracy, individual responsibility, logic, reason are all forms of whiteness. Now, contrast that position to that of my mother. One really liberates people to flourish. One puts people in shackles. So it has to be that at some point the environment has some effect, notwithstanding all your empirical studies.
Yeah, and well, I will just say, God, you better not get too deep into the adoption studies because you'll get real depressed. Because you have children adopted at birth into families just like you described from your background, wonderful parents, intellectually stimulating. Is that good for the adopted children? Absolutely. I'm happy that they were adopted into those great families. Do the adopted kids do a whole lot better than you would be led to expect by their background, their genetic backgrounds? The answer is no.
Got you.
But let's enough on that.
Okay, let's move on.
We both want to believe parents make a difference, and so let's just keep on believing it.
I got you. Okay, we'll talk about the latest book in a second, but since you mentioned Thomas Sowell, I think there's a nice thread here for me to explore. Now, you're someone who didn't pursue the traditional academic career, in that, unless I'm mistaken, you've never taken on a professorial position. Is that true, Charles?
Right.
Right.
That's right.
You never even tried to.
No.
Right. And now in the case of Tom, he certainly did, but then he said, I've had enough, and then went on to become a Hoover Institution fellow and so on. And you've both gone on to publish tons of books, not doing the traditional kind of peer-reviewed journals. Now, is that because, so I don't know how much you can speak for Tom, but is it because you both were going to be tackling the types of topics that would have shackled you had you remained, or had you, in your case, entered academia, and therefore you decided, look, I've got all these things that I want to say. Academia will not afford me the opportunity to do so, so let me take this alternate route. Would that be a fair description of your career paths?
Well, just quickly, as it happens, I just reread Tom Sowell's autobiography. Okay. So I'm up to speed on Tom's background, and I'm calling him Tom instead of Thomas because I've had the honor of being an acquaintance of his. So Tom was the opposite. I think Tom would have been very happy being a theoretical economist and doing highly technical work. His first book was on Say's law, a very technical book in Say's law. And he did start out in academia. He did hold professorships. And of course, we're talking about the late 60s, and he was in great demand despite his unorthodox political views. But he grew increasingly disillusioned.
Yeah.
And disillusioned by, in particular, things that went on with his interactions with students, whereby when he tried to hold their feet to the fire and use exactly the same standards for his black students and his white students and so forth, he drew down a lot of fire from the administration on himself. And he became very disillusioned with academia. I was the opposite. You want to talk about weird ways in which your interests manifest themselves? I can remember as a child, I can't have been more than my early teens at the oldest, and my parents took the Reader's Digest, which back in the day was a very widespread magazine, and I read something about the Rand Institution, which is Rand is one of the very first think tanks. And I remember thinking to myself, that would be really cool. How do you get a job like that? I had that instinctive reaction.
Wow.
That sounded like something I wanted to do. And then when I was in Thailand, first in Peace Corps, and then I was doing research for AID, I really liked the applied research. And the reason I went back to graduate school was in quantitative methods, was because I was convinced I had insights about how Thai villages worked that were way smarter than what the anthropologists were saying about how Thai villages worked. And I was absolutely confident I was right, and I couldn't prove it. They would have their qualitative narratives, and I had my qualitative narratives, and I wanted to be able to say, I'm right, they're wrong, and here's why. And so that's why I went to graduate school, but I always intended to stay in applied research. And in fact, I thought I would stay in applied international research because I really enjoyed the prospect of having a career in which I'd spent 6 years in Thailand, so I'd go spend 4 years in Nigeria and 4 years in Brazil or whatever. That was the life I saw ahead of me. And I was never, either as an undergraduate or in graduate school, attracted to what I saw of the academic life. I didn't fit in very well, so I never tried.
Well, let me assuage any regrets that you may have. I'm starting to head towards the trajectory of, I won't call him Tom since I've not had the privilege and honor of meeting him, so I'll call him Thomas. I'm starting to head towards the Thomas conclusion because, I mean, as you could imagine, and I'm sure you follow the culture wars, it is not easy to be the type of outspoken person that I am in academia. Now, the reality is that the great majority of students are absolutely lovely. I don't get many of the, the insane woke students in my environment, but yet there is a stifling bureaucracy. So even if you take out all the wokeness, which you really can't because it pervades every email that is sent out, there is a lack of velocity of how quickly things happen, right? So we hold a task force meeting to set up a potential task force to discuss the feasibility of having coffee in the faculty lounge. Well, the amount of money and time that it took to have the task force to hold the coffee meeting probably cost the university $8 million, and the coffee would have cost $3. So one of the reasons why I love doing what I do in terms of speaking to people like yourself and others is that there is a quickness in the discussion of ideas, right? I mean, I could have a chat with you now. In 4 hours, I could post this, and then there'll be 25,000 people who hopefully really enjoyed our chat. Now, that doesn't, in no way does that denigrate or, attack the beauty of the peer-reviewed process. It's part of what I do. I love doing good science, good social science. But it's slow, right? A peer-reviewed paper, you might go through 4 rounds before it is published. from the time of inception of the idea to the time that people read it, it might be 4 or 5 years. And then if in 5 years later, 50 people have cited it, then you're super ecstatic about how incredible that paper was, whereas how many people have read your books? So I think one of the things that I dislike about academia is that while, yes, it's a place to create ideas, the dissemination of ideas is not nearly as fast as I would like it to be. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and also there is, as far as I can tell, a lot of pressure on young academics to remain within fairly narrow topics. Oh, yeah. And so I wrote Losing Ground, which is still in print 30-odd years after it was published. I wrote it in my late 30s, and it was published in 1984 when I was 41. And I would never have been encouraged in a university to take on that look at social policy in the Great Society in the 1970s. All the peer pressure on me would have been to work in smaller steps and to work my way up. But the fact is, and I know this from my work in human accomplishment, that we are at our very peak in terms of both a combination of experience and of talent in our 40s. It depends on the specific field. If you're a particle physicist or a pure mathematician, we're talking the first half of your 20s.
Yeah, right.
Doing your best work. But for social scientists, we don't have those demands on us. But the time that intellectually gifted people who are in scholarly pursuits, the best time for them to be applying their very best insights is about the age that I was working on Losing Ground, and that's the age at which a lot of academics are still assistant professors and desperately trying to get tenure by getting enough peer-reviewed articles out.
Yeah. Well, I want to talk about human accomplishments in a second. But when you started your point, you talked about sort of what I would call stay in your lane professors, right? And I actually talk about this briefly in my next book, where I'm talking about the virtues of variety seeking. And specifically, I talk about intellectual variety seeking, the idea that there are so many wonderful intellectual landscapes that I want to visit that I don't want to be a guy who's doing plus epsilon research, right? So let's do another little thing that, very few people will ever read, but then I will be known as the guy in this field, in this incredibly specialized. Now, of course, we need to develop tools of specializations when we're getting the training, but then once I am trained, my goal is to just look for interesting problems, completely unencumbered by disciplinary boundaries. And so in my case, I've published in medicine, in consumer behavior, in evolutionary theory. I've published a paper on applying evolutionary theory in political marketing, right? So as a matter of fact, that which I would consider maybe the most laudable aspects of my CV is held against me as somebody who's got kind of this frivolity. Why aren't you more focused, Dr. Saad? I've been told that actually by schools who are interested in hiring me away, but they said, but unfortunately, you don't have just one research stream. To me, that seems insane, because at the same time, the schools from the other side of their mouth say, we support interdisciplinarity, yet you do everything but support interdisciplinarity, right?
Yeah, and again, you have to distinguish between what goes on in the hard sciences and what goes on if you're a social scientist. If you are a hard scientist and like a particle physicist, you are trying to make the next increment in a vast edifice of knowledge that it's really important to be exactly right. And the vast edifice itself has enormous, no one person's going to do the whole story. If you're a social scientist in the 2020s, and you're a graduate student, and let's say you are in sociology, you better be taking a lot of courses in population genetics. You better be taking a lot of courses in evolutionary psychology. You'd better be, another thing you ought to be doing is you should not be cloistered in a university office. If you're a sociologist and you want to talk about, let's say, the political sociology of the current polarization. Well, guess what? You better know what people are like who live in Topeka, Kansas,
Right.
or are plumbers, or are farmers, or are the MAGA people who voted for Trump. You better have a gut level appreciation of what life is like for them, as well as the very narrow academic circles in which you live. So if the particle physicist is at the Princeton Advanced Institute and doesn't know anybody who's not at Princeton, so what?
Right.
It has no effect on what he's doing. If you are a Princeton sociologist, and the only people who actually know really well are your kind of people in Princeton, you got a problem.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that speaks to another point, which is, I mean, and again, in your case, since you didn't go the traditional academic route, you haven't necessarily faced it. Until very recently, few professors would go out of their way to create a program of public engagement, right? Whereby, now we've got all these incredible tools where we can, have a megaphone for our voices to be heard, right? I mean, my show, I still can't believe the number of people that watch it. Or if I go on Joe Rogan, then forget about the number of people who watch that, right? I mean, it's more than all of the mainstream media combined. And yet I think most academics are still very reticent to engage in that. And I think it's for a couple of reasons. One, I think it's a ego defensive mechanism whereby they actually don't think they can pull it off, right? I mean, it's one thing to be a very rigorous scientist in your lab, whether you're an experimental psychologist or a particle physicist. It's another thing to go for 3 hours on Joe Rogan and make whatever you do seem exciting to 20 million people. Now, one doesn't supersede the other. In an ideal world, you should be able to do both. But the academic absolutely knows that he or she has mastered the former, but can't certainly do the latter, and therefore they castigate it as, it's. And by the way, I've mentioned this before, but it's worth repeating because you probably haven't heard it, Charles. I discussed this in my latest book. I went to Stanford. I was invited to the Stanford Business School, sort of the mecca of academic elitism, to give a scientific talk. And the gentleman who was hosting me had taken me out the night before, and we started talking about the fact that I was appearing, in the upcoming future on Joe Rogan. And so he kind of looks at me with disdain and says, "Yeah, well, at Stanford, we don't support that." I said, "You don't support what exactly?" He said, "Well, we don't do research so that it's sexy enough that it could appear on Joe Rogan." I said, "Well, I don't do research so that I can appear on Joe Rogan, but if we're in the business of creating knowledge and disseminating knowledge, you would think that appearing on Joe Rogan would be something that you would highly support because 20 million people are going to listen to my thing with Joe Rogan." And he was very, very disdainful of that. So I think the second problem then becomes, number one, it's ego defensive. Number two is the universities haven't set up as part of their incentive. They haven't incentivized people to go out. It's not on your CV that you've done this. Your journal articles are, maybe your books, depending on the discipline, but appearing on Joe Rogan, that's worth nothing. Exactly. Do you think we can solve this?
There's I think a couple of different things at work, and one I sympathize with, which is a lot of very, very good social scientists, people whose work I use and respect. They wouldn't be good on TV. They wouldn't be good on Joe Rogan. They wouldn't. That's just not part of their repertoire that they're good at. Okay, I get that. That's all right. But what drives me nuts in academia is people deliberately writing in ways which make it as hard as possible for their readers to know what they're saying. And that somebody, a smart person they can do something about that. They don't have to be charming. They just have to write clear English. But talk about negative incentives. I have written peer-reviewed articles, all right? And I've gone through the peer-review process, and I have, in fact, gotten criticism from the reviewers that my language was too informal. And by that they meant I was using active verbs. I was using short sentences. I was trying to communicate what I was saying, but they wanted me to make it more bureaucratic, is what they really wanted. They wanted me to make the language more academic. And that's just so pathetic, because you look around, who are the social scientists that have enormous influence? They are the Steve Pinkers of the world. who write beautifully, who know the literature, who can say it in non-technical ways, but accurately. Those are the people that are having an impact. And this, by the way, I would include people who I don't like as in terms of what they've written. Stephen Jay Gould.
Right.
Part of the reason Stephen Jay Gould was so effective, particularly in that meretricious book called The Mismeasure of Man.
Right.
But boy, he wrote like a dream, and he was extremely clear, and that should be something that the universities applaud, without even if it. I guess I'm thinking of a distinction between what you experienced regarding Joe Rogan and Stanford and them discouraging you. I've had people discourage me from going on certain shows because I shouldn't be associated with those kinds of people. And, okay, I can kind of sympathize, excuse me, I can kind of sympathize with that as to why they're worried about that, but not writing clearly, there's no excuse.
I think I've got a theory that I'd love to see what you think of it. And actually, I usually use this theory when I'm criticizing postmodernism, but it applies more generally to opaque and obscurantist writing, academic writing. So I think that in the same way that economists suffer from physics envy, right? The idea is that I need to create this mathematization of economics for me to be taken seriously as an economist. So it becomes tons of mathematical stuff that is completely decoupled from reality. But boy, the closed axioms within that model are beautiful, but they describe nothing. But who cares? I've got a lot of Greek letters. And I'm not intimidated by Greek letters. I've got a background in mathematics, right? So because they need to cater to their physics envy, they need to kind of walk with a rigorous walk, right? Now, I think that a lot of the folks over there in the humanities are looking... You're right?
Yeah, I am. Sorry.
No worries. They're looking at those folks in physics and biology and neuroscience and mathematics and saying, how come they're getting all the attention? Well, they're getting all the attention because when you read a math paper, unless you speak that impenetrable language, you're lost within the first sentence, right? I mean, you literally can't get past sentence one. In physics, maybe there's a few words before you get lost. In mathematics, there's nothing. It's a language of its own. Well, how about we, meaning now the charlatans in postmodernism and so on, how about we create an impenetrable language that is so impenetrable that it must be profound, right? And so I've pitched this theory to many folks, and they've said, I think you're exactly right. Well, then I found proof for the veracity of my theory. It came in a conversation between Michel Foucault and John Searle, the American philosopher, where John Searle asks Michel Foucault, how come when I chat with you privately, I seem to be able to follow what you're saying, but when I read your works, it's so much more opaque and difficult to understand? And maybe we should thank him for being honest. Michel Foucault responds, well, in France, you've got to have a lot of stuff that's impossible to understand, otherwise people don't take you seriously. Aha! I was right all along. So I think, again, there is a epistemological insecurity that comes in some of the fields in the humanities and social sciences where opaqueness and impenetrable implies profundity.
I absolutely agree with you.
Oh,
there you, the same thing, yeah.
There you go.
With the postmodernists, there is no other explanation, because the things they are trying to say, if you finally manage to parse them out, are really simple.
Exactly. There you go. All right. So do you want to just briefly, because I want to be able to promote your latest book. So we're going all over the place. We'll come back to more personal stuff. The two main uncomfortable truths in your book are, number one, there are cognitive differences between the races, and there are differences in proclivity to engage in criminality across the two races. Did I summarize that correctly?
Yeah, that's basically true.
Now, I didn't prepare. I wanted to read you a quote from my book. I don't have it, so I'll just paraphrase it. It's a classic kind of setup where I read a quote from someone who's saying something like, well, I'm ashamed to say that when I hear footsteps coming behind me on a street. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
And you know who is the rabid white supremacist racist who said that?
Jesse Jackson.
Boom! Boom! So how can we get people to recognize that, empirical facts really just truly don't care about your... So we could talk about the technical details, but as you said, and as I agree, that's boring. You've done it a million times. I'm interested in the cognitive and emotional obstacles that cause people to erect barriers to at least engage these ideas. Do you have any thoughts about how we can do that?
Oh, well, what we do know, God, is that we have seen a really remarkable change just over the last few years in the degree to which people are saying facts don't matter. Well, I'm sort of speechless because I'm trying to say, what do I say next? But let's go to the issues that are involved with critical race theory and the allegations of systemic racism. Well, if you're going to allege systemic racism, there are ways to support that statement. There are ways in which you need to allow it to be falsified. There has to be some criteria by which we can say, okay, this makes sense in terms of the allegations of systemic racism. This is inconsistent with it. And what we have seen is very open statements that, no, we have no basis for you to falsify this. There are no yardsticks out there that we accept as valid, which would be persuasive evidence that we're wrong about the allegations of systemic racism. That we are asserting a reality anecdotally, rhetorically, without numbers of any kind, and with statements such as the one that I think Kendi makes, that standardized tests are the most vicious and effective of all weapons to oppress blacks. That should be a falsifiable statement. It is a falsifiable statement. It's not accepted that it's falsifiable. So anyway, people ask me why I wrote this book. I wrote this book because the departure from reality in the rhetoric about systemic racism was so complete. Yeah. And it was so thoroughly bought into by the white elites that I said, there aren't too many people who are in a position to push back against this. If you are a 39-year-old assistant professor in a university, you cannot write a book saying this is bullshit.
Yeah.
And with a lot of evidence behind it. You won't get tenure. Even if you're a tenured professor, you'd probably be in trouble. Yeah. And I'm one of the few people at a point in my career where there's nothing they can do to me. And so I was able to do it, so I wrote it. But it was a sort of cri de coeur about someone who believes that it's the exchange of evidence and the argumentation based on the evidence that enables us to make progress. And so I wrote the book as sort of a last attempt to draw this dialogue back into something that resembled a debate over facts.
Well, you mentioned at the start of your talk about the falsification principle, right? So the Popperian epistemology. I would actually add to what you said. It's not just that you can't falsify it according to their progressive, quote, epistemology. That which would be proof of its falsifiability is actually taken as proof of their position. And let me give you... So it's a form of intellectual terrorism that's like a nested mind blank. I'm not going to say the word, the F word. Okay? So, and let me give two examples for you. Example one. A doctoral student in Israel decides that she wants to do a empirical study demonstrating that the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force, engages in systemic or systematic, pick the word, rape of Palestinian women. So she goes out to do that study. She's a Jewish woman herself. I only say this because it's a form of progressive self-flagellation. I'm really bad, right? And so she goes out to do the research. To her dismay, she finds out that there isn't a single documented case of Israeli soldiers raping Palestinian women. Boy, that sounds like a falsification of your position. That really sounds like amazing falsification data. No, it actually demonstrated, Charles, how evil the Israeli soldiers were, because they so othered the Palestinian women that they weren't even worthy of rape. Okay, this is not Gad Saad satire, because I'm pretty proficient at satire. Okay, this is a real doctoral student who I believe won an award for that paper. By the way, it's all referenced in The Parasitic Mind. You can go check it out if you don't believe the veracity of the story. Story two.
Well, the sad thing is, I do believe you, and I'm laughing about something which, in its essence, is very sad. I mean, because you're talking about allegations of rape, but I'm laughing because it's so crazy.
It's insane, and that's why. And I next, I'd like to talk about what is it that we can bottle about, whether it be Thomas Sowell or you or others who stand up and are to be counted. How can we bottle that kind of courage? But let's leave that for a second. Story two. Canadian student at Queen's University wants to demonstrate that there is systemic, love that word, put it everywhere, it's an elixir of life. So there is systemic Islamophobia in Canadian society. It's rampant, it's everywhere, it's in every nook and cranny. So she decides to don a hijab, I think for 18 days, because she's going to now document that, she's being raped everywhere, and she's being accosted and insulted. She finds out that the Canadians were unbelievably kind, gracious, sweet, tolerant, everything that she didn't think. Did that falsify her position, Charles? No. They're so full of hate inside towards Muslims that they overcompensate by a manifest kindness. So their kindness, their tolerance, their politeness was exactly a manifestation of Islamophobia. Once you've reached that level of epistemological terrorism, you've lost your capacity to reason. You're dead. You're finished, right?
Yeah, and I'm thinking of listeners who are saying, "Oh, God he's exaggerating," and it's not. It's really you aren't, because for example, there's benevolent sexism.
Yes.
Benevolent sexism is men being respectful of women, of being encouraging and helpful, being a gentleman with regard to women. And so that's evident of sexism. And of course, with the racism, just as in the Islamic example, the people who are respectful of their black colleagues who are white, they're overcompensating, and they are, because they're overcompensating, it is revealing their inner hostility toward blacks and so forth. It is everywhere in every topic. You remember Pat Moynihan's phrase, everyone's entitled to his own opinion, but not to his own facts.
Sure.
A wonderful line. That's outdated. Everybody is entitled to his own facts. There is no common body of material which we can come together on and say, okay, let's fight over this. But there are rules for fighting. There's playing fair and there's not playing fair. And so that's the only way forward. I mentioned Steve Pinker earlier, his current book on rationality, which I have not read reviews of. He's another person who is trying desperately to retrieve the situation. I don't think it's going to happen very soon.
Yeah.
I think it's going to happen eventually, just because it has to. We're in the Thermidorian phase, perhaps, of the revolution. Well, maybe we're approaching the Thermidorian. But right now, it's pretty bleak.
So what do you think it will take for us to redress the ship? I mean, sure, we can have people who are outspoken, who are irreverent, who do have large followings, who, will bring people to the side of Team Reason. But that's a slow process. Do you think there's a way for us to have a cat? I mean, in a sense, Donald Trump was hated precisely because he was that cataclysmic sort of doorstop that was ending some of the way the fulcrum was shifting. And he comes along and the party's going to end. The swamp is going to be dried and all this kind of stuff. And therefore we have to get rid of him because the party won't go, the epistemological terrorism and so on won't go on. Is there a way for, is this going to be a 50-year battle where eventually we win Team Reason, or could it happen much more quicker? And if so, how?
Let's restrict the conversation for the moment to the social sciences, because that's something we both know a lot about, and we both know those communities pretty well. I've had some second thoughts since I published Human Diversity in early 2020. And in Human Diversity, I argue that the social sciences are going to be revolutionized by growing genetic and neuroscientific knowledge. And that this is not something we should be scared of. It should be a very exciting time to be a social scientist, because finally we are going to have tools at our disposal which enable us to be a lot closer to real scientists than we've ever had a chance to be before. And I go on to try to make that case with regard to the study of sex differences and race differences and class differences. I still believe in the long-term outcome, which it'll revolutionize it. But I think there's going to be an interregnum, sort of a period of quiescence. And let me give you a specific example that I think we're already seeing. One of the main topics for those people who are engaged in social policy is the role of the family. We talked about it ourselves at the beginning of the session, but what the main social policy debate has been, to what extent can you use interventions from outside to compensate for socioeconomic disadvantage and thereby provide the same outcomes that are enjoyed by kids who are in high SES backgrounds and stable family backgrounds and so forth. And the optimists have been those who have said these are basically environmentally caused differences. They're grounded in poverty, in education, in other socioeconomic factors. We can compensate for those. For a long time, you had very discouraging data from their point of view about the effectiveness of those outside interventions. But it could be continued to be argued, well, we'll get it right the next time, and the next project to help disadvantaged kids through a mentoring program or through educational reach. Next time we'll get it right. We'll go with early childhood, infant interventions, and so forth. The results empirically have never been encouraging. In fact, on the contrary, the results have been quite minor, and they've also, you can get results on exit tests. They attenuate very quickly over time. But the debate went on. Now, as the knowledge about the role of genetics in a lot of these traits increases, the argument is already showing signs of shifting. There was a publication of a book just a few months ago by Catherine Page Harden, the title of which I don't think I have right. But anyway, the basic thesis of the book was, she says, I'm a progressive. I am in favor of social justice. I also acknowledge the science on the role of genetics in behavioral traits. But that's okay, because I can hold these positions and we can advance the cause of social justice by incorporating this information. And by the way, I don't share her politics. I share her view that there's no conflict between assimilating this information and making use of it, even though you were a person on the left. Fine. I think that it's not going to work out that way. I think that people on the left who have been most adamant that these things can be fixed through environmental interventions are going to have to continue their work at this point in an environment where they understand there is widespread acknowledgement that they're wrong. That nothing can be done. But, well, let me give you a specific example.
Sure.
I think it's going to become increasingly evident that if there were social policies that could increase the proportion of children who grow up in stable two-parent families, wouldn't raise their IQs, but it would lower the delinquency rate.
Right.
It would increase the emotional stability rate, because if there are some things where a two-parent family does seem to make a difference, it's in those kinds of characteristics. People on the left are not going to be able to reconcile themselves to policy interventions with the purpose of increasing marriage.
Right.
Two-parent family. They just won't do it. And so even though the understanding of this new knowledge gives us new insights into what needs to be done to decrease the level of child suffering in a lot of these areas, the solutions are going to be one which are fundamentally unacceptable to people of a certain political position. And the response is not going to be able to be, in response to a book like Catherine Page Hardin's, they aren't going to be able to be, she's wrong about the science. She's right. And she is right about science, which is increasingly consensually accepted among people who know the data. So they aren't going to be able to say she's wrong. What they are going to do is just keep quiet about it.
Right.
And I think that in some ways, the dropping of the SAT for admission to colleges as a requirement is another indication of this. The data are quite clear about the SAT. It is not biased in favor of white, affluent kids. Despite all the stories about, they get this test prep and that jacks up their scores by 200 points, and the other kids don't get it, all of that stuff has been looked at with a fine-tooth comb. All of the roles of test prep and of socioeconomic status, they've all been examined. In every case, the best predictor of your SAT score at age 18 are cognitive tests taken at very young ages. And as we get polygenic scores for IQ, it's going to turn out that what best predicts your SAT scores at age 18, regardless of your socioeconomic status, is your polygenic score, which is establishable at birth.
Right.
Okay, so if that's the case, I think that people will say, we're still going to drop the SAT because we don't like it. I think that's really where we're at. And it's going to take a very long time to recover from that sort of thing. With one final parting shot on this, Scott, you know who suffers the most from getting rid of the SAT? The really smart kid from a working class family, he or she black or white or Latino or whatever, who had as a high SAT score a way of sticking up their hand and saying to the admissions office, not only am I the right color that you're looking for your admissions, I'm really smart.
Right.
And to take that away is a huge loss.
A lot of stuff to unpack there. Thank you for that answer. One small exception one small point I'm gonna take exception with. Maybe it was a Freudian slip. You said for social scientists to become real scientists. Well, I don't think that social scientists are not real scientists. Maybe you meant to say natural scientists. I think
real, but never mind.
What? Sorry, what'd you say?
I didn't mean real.
You didn't mean real. Okay. Well, I mean, I think a scientist is anyone who uses the liberating and breathtaking tools of the scientific method. You can be an English lit professor and be a scientist, and I can explain how if you'd like. You can be a historian and be a very rigorous scientist. You could be a sociologist or a political scientist and be a very serious scientist. What makes you a scientist is not whether you study the atom. As a matter of fact, Auguste Comte, when he came up with his hierarchy of the sciences, placed sociology at the top because he argued that it's a lot more difficult to study complex creatures called humans and social systems than it is to study the crystallography structure of diamonds. I mean, he didn't give that example, but I'm filling that in. So I don't think that there is anything in the epistemology of social science that makes it less sciencey. Here's how it is less sciencey. It is less sciencey when you stop adhering to the scientific method, when you allow ideology to parasitize your pursuit of science, right? So as a matter of fact, I'm working on a project with one of my graduate students right now where we're going to be testing some of these ideas, where I can take the exact same epistemology and methodology, but if I couch it in a language that sounds sciencey, like we're going to study the brain imaging of a chimpanzees for fear arousal, and I ask you how sciencey that is, then you're going to say, oh, that's sciencey. He's wearing a white lab coat. If I give you the exact same structure of the problem, but I say we're going to study how consumers respond to fear appeals, nothing has changed. The epistemology hasn't changed. The methodology hasn't changed. The data analyses approaches haven't changed. Well, that sounds like it's business school applied stuff. So I think there is a bias whereby people think something is sciencey or not, depending on certain accoutrements. So I don't think you need to feel any shame because you're a political scientist. You should feel shame if you let your ideology temper with how truthful you are in the pursuit of science. Does that make sense? Did I make a good defense of social science?
I think I'm appropriately rebuked in one sense, and for all the reasons you gave. You can have rigor in the social sciences, just as you have rigor in any other. I guess the way that I would still say I have physics envy is that, you know, what you're trying to do with your analyses is reduce the amount of noise as much as possible to increase the accuracy of your predictions. And it's really tough. And so in the social sciences, yeah, it is really, really hard. So that with physics, you can predict years ahead of time these bizarre things that black holes will do, and lo and behold, 30 years later, it's verified down to the last nanometer of precision. And in my line of work, if you can explain 40% of the variance,
you're celebrating.
Yeah. So there is a way in which the hard sciences, we're going to improve the precision of our tools a whole lot. Right. Because of the neuroscientific and genetic information.
So that was going to be my second point that I was going to talk about. So I'm delighted that you mentioned, of course, neuroscience and so on. But earlier you mentioned two words that are very dear to my heart. You said evolutionary psychology, which you may know that I, with all due modesty, I founded a new discipline called evolutionary consumption, which is the application of evolutionary biology and evolutionary psychology to study consumer behavior. And I define consumer behavior very broadly. It's not just Coca-Cola and Starbucks. We consume friendships, we consume religion, we consume popular culture. Everything is consumatory. And so one of the things that I've argued, and here I learned this word from E.O. Wilson in his unbelievable book in the late 90s, Consilience, right?
I love that book.
Isn't it unbelievable? Anybody who's listening to this conversation, when this conversation ends, you go out, you buy that book immediately. Well, consilience, of course, you know the meaning, Charles, but let me mention it for our readers. It's unity of knowledge, right? It's the fact that you could make links between the arts, the social sciences, the natural sciences, in a true epistemological, grand, interdisciplinary way. Well, I argue in my work, but more generally for the social sciences, hence to link back to your point, that the only way that the social sciences are ever going to reach the same level of epistemological prestige as the natural sciences is if they have an organizing framework that drives their knowledge in the same way that the natural sciences do. And there's only one game in town. It's called evolutionary theory. You can't study human behavior without recognizing the evolutionary forces that have shaped this organ called the human mind. And yet, generations of 100 years of students have perfectly studied sociology, economics, consumer psychology, political science, and the rest of it without ever uttering the word biology. Now, imagine how insane that is. There are 2 million... I can't remember the exact number, but let's go with 2 million sexually reproducing species. 1,999,999 you would never dare study without ever invoking the evolutionary mechanisms that led to the evolution of that species. But there is this one species that exists on the supra plane of magic called non-biology. So I can study political science, I could study consumer behavior, I could study economics, fully detached, fully decoupled from my biological heritage. Once that lacuna is closed, once that problem is resolved, then I think we will be as prestigious as natural sciences. Dr. Murray, what do you think of that position?
I agree 100%.
My God, we're supposed to disagree on something, man. You're not making this fun. No.
I see the human diversity, which, by the way, I am very fond of. It went into a black hole. It was not reviewed in any major outlets, and it is a dense, long book. But anyway, it starts out by saying the social sciences have been scared stiff of biology. And I want to talk about the ways in which these links are being made. But I also explicitly say in the first chapter, I'm going to give very little attention to evolutionary psychology. And I said the reason I'm not going to do it is because I have learned that as soon as you do that, your critics jump on that because they can say, oh, it's all just so stories. Exactly. You have these people who have a political agenda and they observe a trait in human beings now and they come up with these stories for why it had to be that way. It has been a really effective strategy, God. They really get a lot of mileage out of that. And so I said, okay, I'm just going to talk about what we've learned about human differences that exist as opposed to the role of evolution. But here's where, in the long run, your position is not only correct, it will prevail. And that is that what we're really doing is rediscovering human nature. And if there is something that people have known, human beings have known throughout human history until the last 100 years, it was that there was a thing called human nature. And it was hard to specify, it was hard to define in lots of ways, but there are certain ways in which the human animal has underlying instincts, underlying drives, and the rest of it. And the fact is that despite the cheap shots that are taken about just so stories, enormous progress has been made already in spelling out the evolutionary psychology, the mechanisms at work, and the genetics feeding into this now are going to provide ways to take the increasing power of the evolutionary psychological theory and infuse it with concrete evidence of evolution that's taken place. So your task, as to some degree mine, is to live long enough to see ourselves vindicated and to read the full page ads in the New York Times that are going to be taken out by the blank slaters saying we were wrong. I'm sure it'll happen, but that's what
I call them, by the way, flat earthers of the human mind.
That's a good phrase.
You like that one? I think I first mentioned it in my chat with Danielle Dennett, who was on my show a few years ago. Let me mention the just so story point, and then maybe one or two other questions. Do we still have about 10 minutes? Can you grant me about 10 more minutes?
Sure.
Oh, great. Thank you. Thank you. I'm really enjoying this. I despise the just story attack more than any of the other lines of attacks, because while they are all, let me be undiplomatic, profoundly imbecilic, none is more imbecilic than the just so story one. And let me explain why. And I've written scientific papers on this. It's in chapter 7 of my latest book. So one of the unbelievably powerful tools of evolutionary thinking is this idea of nomological networks of cumulative evidence. So, for example, if I want to demonstrate to you that something is an adaptation, how can I go about building a tsunami of evidence that makes it incontrovertible that my position is veridical? Well, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to get you cross-cultural data, right? So, I mean, if I show you that the hourglass figure that men prefer applies as much in the Hadza tribe or the Yanomamo tribe in the Amazon as it does in every other culture that's been studied, that's already compelling evidence. But I'm going to get you cross-cultural data. I'm going to get you cross-temporal data across time periods. I'm going to get you cross-disciplinary data, cross-methodology data. So it's more than just the typical triangulation. It's a triangulation on steroids using temporal periods, human cultures, disciplinary approaches, and so on, so that the data becomes so incontrovertible that it's unassailable. So it genuinely, it epistemologically offends me when these imbeciles say that evolutionary psychologists just sit around sipping cognac with, smoking pipes, just pontificating these just so stories, when the reality is that the evidentiary threshold that we set before we establish that something is an adaptation is actually a lot more than all the other sciences. But apparently, because we're talking about something that happened in the distal past, it must be post hoc. In which case, I tell people, well, you better advise astrophysicists that they are fake scientists because they're theorizing about something that happened way before human evolution. So they must be fake scientists too. So it is so galling because that's one of the main places where I haven't been able to get my colleagues to concede. So I wait just like you for the articles to come out saying that we were proven right and we're vindicated. But I fear that human vanity won't allow it to happen anytime soon. What do you think?
I think the first break in the dike will be with regard to sex differences.
Right.
Because the first, genetic race differences is such an explosive topic. It is so taboo that it'll probably be quite a while before we know nearly as much about population differences as we know about sex differences. But with sex differences, an awful lot of progress is being made. One of the healthiest aspects of this that some of the most brilliant and most productive scholars in this are women. And when you're talking about the neuroscience of the human brain and the lateralization of the brain, sex differences in the lateralization of the brain, just wonderful work has been done, and it ties in with evolutionary psychology in really specific ways. That if you have certain things that were clearly different from males and females in the course of evolution in terms of their evolutionary fitness, such as, for example, the role of women in nurturing children, which is to say, if you were a woman who didn't love small babies, you were unlikely to pass on your genes, and that has an effect over time on whether women tend to be nurturers of small children. You can tie that into all sorts of very specific things that we can see now increasingly, not completely, but increasingly, in all sorts of things within the brain, in which males and females are different in the encoding of memory, in the encoding of the emotional response to memory, and so forth and so on. This is an area in which, as I was doing human diversity, I sense that there is a very broad consensus among neuroscientists in this regard. Are there any Cordelia Fine, who herself is not a neuroscientist, she can write a book called Testosterone Rex, which gets all sorts of prizes and bestseller lists and adulatory reviews in the New Yorker and the New York Times. But I asked one neuroscientist, I said, how come it's so hard to find technical critiques of her books in the literature? He said, because nobody pays any attention to them. They're so obviously nonsense.
Yeah.
And so within neuroscience, you already are getting an ally. By you, I mean evolutionary psychology. Yeah. You're already getting an ally that is going to make your already strong case absolutely impregnable.
Yeah, well, I think so. To add to what we're saying, there's a distinction in levels of analyses, scientific analyses or scientific explanations between what's called proximate explanations and ultimate explanations. Proximate explanations is where much of science operates. It's the how and the what of a phenomenon. And that's perfectly fine. Most Nobel Prizes have been won at the proximate level. What evolutionary theory does, in addition to explaining proximate mechanisms, is it adds a completely new level of analysis, which is called the ultimate explanation. This is not ultimate in the superior sense. It's the ultimate. It's ultimate in the unfolding of the Darwinian causation all the way up to the original why. So if you talk about, say, why do men and women exhibit sex differences when it comes to the romantic the romantic jealousy that they experience when it comes to sexual infidelity? Well, we can say, oh, men have higher testosterone levels, therefore they react more aggressively. Well, that may or may not be true, but that is a proximate explanation. The ultimate explanation is that men have had to recurringly deal with the threats of paternity uncertainty, and therefore they have evolved the emotional, cognitive, and behavioral systems that would cause them to be reacting very adversely to the possible threat of their woman sleeping with another guy, because we're a biparental species. I don't want to raise the really sexy gardener's child for the next 20 years. So it's not that proximate explanations are lower than ultimate, is that you need both levels of analyses to fully tick off explaining a phenomenon. Once all social scientists recognize what I just said the last 2 minutes, we'll have a revolution in the social sciences, because we will be armed with much bigger epistemological tools for full explanations of phenomena.
Yeah. And your ultimate explanation in the specific example you gave of guys wanting to be confident that they're the real father, guess what? If you are a guy who doesn't pay any attention to whether you're the real father, you're less likely to pass on.
It's not difficult to explain, exactly. Or if you're attracted to, I mean, it's not the patriarchy that doesn't make me be attracted to Betty White. It's because guys who were, consistently attracted only to Betty White types did not pass on those genes when they mated with postmenopausal women. Like, it doesn't take a huge evolutionary biologist to understand that mechanism. Okay, couple of questions, personal, and then we'll wrap it up. Question 1, which I kind of promised that I would ask earlier. Guys like you, Thomas Sowell, others outspoken guys, is that just the unique genetic combinations of your personhoods that make you honey badgers, and there is nothing we can do to teach that to others? Or is there a seminar we can go to called Charles Murray / Thomas Sowell, How to Be a Honey Badger 101? Where do we fall?
Well, I think that Thomas Sowell and I are quite different in this regard. Sorry about my voice.
No worries. Well, you're both courageous in tackling issues that other people wouldn't. That's what I mean. You're similar.
In my case, my wife says that I am convinced every time I write a book that this time I'm going to say it so clearly and so humanely that people can't possibly disagree, and that all say, now I understand. I really do not go into a book saying, oh, I'm really going to get their backs up with this one. And in fact, I've been criticized for both human diversity and facing reality for soft pedaling things. And I did, because I wanted to write. I want to write books that are read by people who don't agree with me. And what that amounts to these days, there's no way that I can appeal to the woke. I'm the Antichrist and Satanist and that sort of thing. But center left, that's my ideal reader. They read the New York Times, and they believe what they read in the op-ed pages, but they also read the science section. And so I want to reach them. And I am not trying to be controversial. Having said that, is it true that there's just got to be some aspect to my personality that likes this stuff? There has to be. I mean, but I don't. That's not how I see myself as a personality. I do not see myself as going out and seeking controversy. I guess I do have a strong sense of irritation at what sounds to me like people saying what they wish were true rather than what they know to be true.
Right. See,
so there is that element, I think, in me.
So let me maybe answer it. Let me answer the question that I posed you, and maybe modestly interject myself amongst you two giants. I think what probably unites people who are irreverent to the orthodoxy is probably, so remember earlier when I discussed the story with my son, and I said, oh, he gave an example that was consequentialist. And so one of the things that when you talk about ethics, right, you have deontology. It is never okay to lie. That's a deontological statement. consequentialist, it's okay to lie if you're trying to protect someone's life, right? Well, I argue that when it comes to the defense of the truth, then you have to put on very quickly your deontological hat. In other words, I never am willing to sacrifice a millimeter of the truth for consequentialist purposes. Much of life operates in the consequentialist world because very few things are deontological. One thing that is deontological is the truth with a capital T. So I think if we were to do an empirical study of people who are honey badgers, it's probably they score very highly. And there's a doctoral dissertation for you. They probably score very highly on support of deontological ethics in the quest of truth. Because effectively, what are you doing when you do all the controversial stuff? You're saying, look, here is the empirical truth, and I'm not willing to back down because people are going to hate me. Whereas most people would say, I'm not willing to enter this arena. Truth be damned. Could that be what unites all the folks who stand up as honey badgers?
Yeah, I think it is. And it used to be I think a much more widespread characteristic of academia.
Yeah.
One of my favorite stories about Dick Herrnstein, my co-author on The Bell Curve, is one night when we'd already had a couple of shots across our bow, even though the book hadn't been published yet. I was up visiting him in Boston, and we were sitting late at night having a scotch, and I said something to the effect of, why are we doing this? And Dick said, the day I got tenure at Harvard was the happiest day of my life. And because here I was going to get paid for the rest of my life to do what I love doing. And he said, but I said, what's the catch? And Dick asked himself that. And Dick said, the catch is you have to tell the truth.
Boom.
And that should be the reaction of everybody who's gotten tenure. I have an obligation to tell the truth.
Exactly.
And that's the essence of being an academician. So I guess I'd discard the word, the honey badger thing. I think that we go with Jonathan Haidt, who says that the telos of the university is the search for truth. And you can't have more than one telos. You can have a social justice telos, or you can have a search for truth telos, but you can't have both.
Right.
And so I think, and here you and I can self-congratulate ourselves, I think both of us are coming out of tradition, which is at the heart of what scholarship is supposed to mean.
Amen. Amen. Last question. And maybe it's particularly fitting for someone who is at your stage in your life. And I don't mean that in a pejorative way, but you're a bit older than me. Older, but still vibrant, still many years left in that brain of yours and body. So in one of the last chapters of the book that I'm currently working on, it's a book about, recipe for the good life and so on. I talk about, someone who's lived a good life is someone who could kind of look back and hopefully they have as few regrets as possible. If you have none, that's even better. I think the Greeks talked about ataraxia, right? This kind of tranquility of mind. And I think that, if you are consumed by regretful feelings, I should have done this, I shouldn't have done that, then you don't have ataraxia. And so before I pose the question to you, let me contextualize it actually in one of my former professors of psychology in my graduate training, Thomas Gilovich, who pioneered the work of psychology of regret, whereby he differentiated between regret due to action versus regret due to inaction. So regret due to action, I regretted that I cheated on my wife and this led to our divorce. Regret to inaction, I regret that I never pursued my dancing career and I went into my dad's accounting firm. I didn't manifest my deepest desires. Now, it turns out that for long-term issues, most people, their biggest regret is one of inaction. So having set that whole thing up, Dr. Murray, what are your regrets in life, if any?
I have been incredibly lucky. It's, if there's anything that drives me toward religion, and I'm increasingly drawn to religion, it is so many things have worked out so well for me. There are things that seem to have been meant to be. But chief among these is not the books I've written. It is I found my soulmate, and
yes.
everything else is rounding error, basically. Well, there are two things. You find somebody that is your life's companion, that you're very happy with. I use the word soulmate because that's what it feels like. And the second thing is you're doing something you love to do. And so the rest is rounding error. And so what I want to say to people who aspire to success in the same kind of field I've been in, be careful what you wish for in terms of public acclaim, even if it's positive. There are all sorts of ways that can work to your disadvantage as well. It's the fact is it's the process of doing this, of creating this stuff that is so deeply satisfying. And fame, fortune, and all the cliches about fame and fortune and so forth are true. They do not provide the deep, lasting satisfactions. And so what are my regrets? A trivial answer. I kind of regret I never went into the military.
Oh.
It was during the World War, it was during the Vietnam War, and I was the right age. I was over in Thailand at the time. But I look upon that as one of the rites of passage that I never did, that I wish I did, except I might have gotten killed if I'd done it. Other than that, I'm 78, so I suppose I should still knock on wood. The Greeks say, count no man happy until he is dead. But for the first 78 years of my life, whether through dumb luck or something else, I have reached age of 78, a very happy and contented man.
You know, I so love that you talked about soulmate and do something that you love, because again, I'm not trying to plug the next book, but it's convergence of thoughts. I have a chapter on, you know, the top two things you can do either to ensure that you'll be miserable or to ensure that you'll be happy is choosing the right mate and choosing the right, you know, profession. And my argument is that you're spending most of your waking time either doing the job that you do or amongst your family. If both of these are places of bliss or both of these are places of misery or whatever it is, then you're well on your way to either being a miserable person or not. And I share your sentiments about finding a soulmate. I'll tell a story here which is in the book, but I don't think I've mentioned publicly. Every morning my wife and I go for a long walk, even in the brutal cold of the Montreal winter. And we're always walking hand in hand. We've been married. We've been together for 21 plus years. And so one day a gentleman stops us who is the father of one of my daughter's dad. He knows us through our daughter. And he stops. Oh, nice to see you. And he goes, do you mind if I ask you something, Gad? I said, sure. He goes, how do you do it? I say, how do I do what? He goes, how is it that I see you every day walking with your wife, you're holding hands, and you're speaking to each other and you're smiling? I said, because I love her. You know, and it was really that simple, is that I was fortunate enough to find someone who's truly my best friend. And while I'm not sure that there is an exact scientific recipe of how you ensure that you find that person, there are certainly scientific evidence of who you should not be choosing. And so you can certainly put the odds in your favor by looking out for certain things that either will increase your likelihood of finding a soulmate or not. So I'm delighted that you found you. How long have you been together, you and your wife?
We are on our 34th year now. We've been together now since 1981, got married in 1983. I will give you my shorthand term for that I give as advice to young people.
I'm listening.
Is this the one? And I say, what you want to do is marry someone who is your very best friend to whom you are also sexually attracted.
That's it. That's the whole thing. Well, and even, by the way, of course, hopefully you'll always be sexually attracted, but that early phase of the butterflies, that won't necessarily always be there. But the fact that I'd rather be with this person rather than going out with boys' night. See, I write in the book that I've never understood boys' night and girls' night. That to me would be an offense to my marriage. What does that mean? I don't want to be with you every Friday night. that doesn't make sense. The reality is, you are my best friend. I want to hang out with you. So I agree. Best friend with whom you have sex with, and you're in good shape. Charles, what a pleasure to talk to you. I'm glad that we finally connected. Are there any projects that you want to mention that you'd like to use this opportunity to promote that otherwise people are not aware of yet?
No, I am sort of retired. And I say sort of retired because there are things in the back of my mind that may eventually develop, but they may not. So,
got you. Okay, stay on the line so we could say goodbye offline. Thank you so much. A real honor and privilege to speak to you. Thank you for granting me so much time. Cheers, Charles.
My pleasure.
All right.